town of Deep Hollow isn't the kind of place where you'd expect strange things to happen, at least not at first glance. It was a quiet, forgotten place with a fading main street, dense woods that seemed to swallow sound, and people who kept to themselves. My mom and I lived in a creaky two-story house built back in the late 1800s, a relic from a time when the town had flourished. The house had seen generations come and go, and sometimes you could feel that history pressing down on you, like the air itself was thicker with the weight of long-forgotten secrets. The wood floors groaned under every step, and no matter how softly you walked, every sound on the first floor carried up to the second. Living in that house, I quickly learned one thing: nothing stayed hidden for long. That Halloween night, my mum left me alone with her laptop while she worked a late shift. It wasn't unusual for her to work nights, and I didn't mind having the house to myself, at least not usually. But there was something different about that night. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the house felt expectant, like it was waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake it off, sprawled across my bedroom floor, chatting with friends online. The upstairs was carpeted, but the first floor still had its old hardwood floors, scarred and groaning with age. I was used to hearing footsteps below, used to the way the sounds traveled up through the walls. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that those familiar noises were about to take a sinister turn. Around 7 p.m., I heard my mum's car pull into the driveway. It was her black sedan. I'd recognize the sound of that engine anywhere. I hurried to shut my laptop, worried she'd catch me using it without permission. From my room, I heard the familiar sounds, the front door creaking open, her footsteps on the hardwood, the soft thud of bags being dropped on the desk. It was the routine of it that put me at ease. I knew those sounds as well as I knew my own heartbeat, and I didn't think twice about them. But halfway down the stairs, everything changed. I stopped cold. The house, every light in it, was pitch black. It wasn't just dark. It was the kind of darkness that feels alive, pressing in around you like it's waiting to swallow you whole. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat sharp and jagged. How could she have come in without turning on any lights? I stayed frozen for a moment, straining to listen, hoping to hear the shuffle of her footsteps or the rustle of her bags. But there was only silence, a silence so thick it seemed to hum. Slowly, I crept down another step, squinting into the dark. And that's when I saw it, or rather, what I didn't see. Her car wasn't in the driveway. The streetlight outside cast a dim yellow glow, illuminating the empty stretch of pavement. No sign she had ever been there. That's when the fear hit me. It came fast and hard, tightening around my chest. If my mum wasn't home, then who had opened the door? I spun on my heel and bolted back upstairs, slamming my bedroom door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, finally clicking it into place. Grabbing the phone, I dialed her number with trembling fingers. She picked up on the first ring, her voice calm, oblivious to my growing panic.
"I'm still on my way, honey,"
she said.
"I'll be home in about 30 minutes.
I dropped the phone onto the bed, my breathing shallow and rapid. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of my imagination, a misunderstanding, but then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing across the floor below. They weren't hurried or random, they were measured, purposeful, as if whoever or whatever was down there was searching for something. The sound echoed up through the floorboards, creeping into the marrow of my bones. I grabbed the phone again and tried calling my friends. One after another, each call ended with a busy signal. It was as if the world outside had sealed itself off, leaving me trapped with the unseen presence below. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, like multiple people were now moving back and forth. My pulse hammered in my ears, my throat dry with fear. I knew I couldn't stay locked in my room forever. I had to find out what was happening. Swallowing hard, I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The air felt thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I moved toward the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. And just as my foot touched the top stair, the footsteps below started again. This time, they matched my movements, step for step. I descended slowly, my heart thundering in my chest. The house remained steeped in darkness, save for the faint light filtering through the windows. Long, thin shadows stretched across the walls, their shapes shifting and twisting with each step I took. I reached the bottom and forced myself to move toward the living room, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. But the room was empty. There was nothing, just silence, thick, oppressive silence, as if whatever had been there had disappeared the moment I arrived. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed the laptop and sprinted back upstairs, slamming my door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I opened the screen and frantically messaged a friend, typing out everything that had just happened. But before I could finish, the lights downstairs flickered on, all at once. The footsteps stopped, and the house went still. It was the kind of stillness that feels wrong, like the calm before a storm. And then I heard it, the sound of the front door opening. My mum walked in, her keys jingling, bags rustling. She greeted me like nothing had happened, oblivious to the terror I'd just experienced. I ran downstairs, breathless, stumbling over my words as I told her everything. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed with concern, but there was no answer in her eyes.
It was probably just your imagination,
She said, though I could tell she didn't entirely believe it herself. And I knew, deep down, that it hadn't been my imagination. The strange things didn't stop after that night. They lingered, like a shadow that follows too closely. Every now and then, when I was alone, I'd hear those same heavy footsteps pacing, searching, never finding. I never had the courage to investigate further. Some doors are better left unopened. And that Halloween night in Deep Hollow, well, it taught me that the scariest things aren't always the ones you see. Sometimes, the real horror lies in what almost reveals itself in the things lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. My boyfriend, Nick, and I had only just begun what we believed would be the next great chapter of our lives. The old house, nestled in the rolling hills of Colorado, promised so much. A spacious home surrounded by sprawling gardens and dense woods, far from the noise and troubles of the modern world. The air there seemed fresher, the stars brighter, and we were eager to leave the past behind us and start anew. But excitement has a way of curdling, and soon the promise of peace gave way to something else entirely. Something dark, unsettling, and impossible to explain. When we arrived, the house was in need of serious repairs. The kitchen walls sagged with age, and the master bedroom required new flooring. Nick worked long hours, leaving me to handle the unpacking and oversee the repairs alone. With no furniture to fill the space yet, the house felt hollow, as if it echoed with memories not our own. The wooden floors whispered with every step, each creak magnified by the emptiness. But there was one place in particular, the small bedroom across the house, that seemed to carry a presence I couldn't shake. It was the first room we had chosen to sleep in upon arriving, but something about it felt off, like stepping into a place where you weren't welcome. I would stand in the doorway, my breath shallow, my skin prickling as if the air itself wanted me out. There were no words for the sensation, a paralyzing fear that gripped me every time I lingered too long. Though nothing tangible ever happened in that room, the oppressive feeling it carried was enough to drive me away. One night, while Nick was away on business, I decided to try sleeping in that dreaded room, accompanied only by Max, our loyal dog. I told myself that fear was irrational, just an overactive imagination feeding off the silence of an old house. But the moment I lay down, I knew I had made a mistake. The room felt suffocating, the darkness thick as though it had mass. It pressed down on me, and I swore I could feel unseen eyes lingering in the shadows. Max whimpered beside me, ears pinned back, as if sensing what I could not. By 4 a.m, my nerves shattered. Grabbing Max by the collar, I fled to the safety of my car and waited for the sun to rise, trembling in the cold pre-dawn air. A week later, the repairs were finally complete, and we moved into the new master bedroom on the opposite side of the house. I told myself the worst was behind us. Emma, a close friend, arrived shortly after with her husband, who, like Nick, had to leave for military training. For the next few weeks, Emma and I would be left alone in the house. At first, we welcomed solitude, imagining cozy nights and idle conversations. But as fate would have it, our nights together coincided with the creeping presence of Halloween. The first night Emma stayed, she knocked on my door in the dead of night, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She claimed her bed had started shaking violently, so much so that she couldn't bear to stay in that room a moment longer. I laughed it off, thinking she had dreamed it, and told her she could sleep in my room. But no sooner had we settled down than the bed beneath us began to tremble, soft at first, then harder, until it felt like the earth itself had come alive. We lay in frozen silence, too afraid to speak, waiting for the shaking to cease. It did, but not for long. The following night, both Emma's bed and mine quaked again. This time, the tremors felt deliberate, as if something unseen had decided to torment us. Stranger still, the disturbances only happened when no one else was in the house, only Emma and me, alone in the vast emptiness. The room Emma had been staying in was, of course, the same one that had filled me with such unexplainable dread. After that night, she refused to sleep there again. One evening, she told me that although she had closed the closet door and turned off the fan before going to bed, she woke to find the door wide open and the fan spinning at full speed. Worse, she swore she heard scratching noises inside the closet, like claws scraping against wood, as if something trapped within was desperate to escape. From that point on, we avoided the room entirely, though the feeling of being watched never left us. Even walking past the door made the air grow heavier, as if the shadows inside were coiled tight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then came the night the lights went out. Emma was in the bathroom, and I was in the bedroom, when, without warning, both rooms were plunged into darkness. At first, I thought it was a power outage, but when we checked the rest of the house, every other light was still on. Only the 2 rooms we occupied were affected. Puzzled and unnerved, I called my father, an experienced electrician, but he insisted everything should be working fine. After nearly 20 minutes of arguing over the phone, we returned to the bedroom, only to find the lights flickered back on as though nothing had ever been wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, we set up a video camera in the kitchen, aiming it down the hall toward the bedrooms. It was Halloween night, and we wanted proof, anything to confirm what we had been experiencing. The camera was fully charged, set to record for 4 hours, but when we reviewed the footage the next morning, what we found chilled us to the bone. The video was distorted, the images warped, and shadows flickered across the walls, shadows that didn't belong to any of us. Worse, the battery had drained after just 6 minutes, though we had charged it to full. As time passed, the strange occurrences continued, though they became less menacing. One night, we gathered around a bonfire with Nick's friends. The men went inside to grab beer and snacks, leaving Emma and me alone by the fire. Suddenly, Stark, one of the guests, burst out of the house, his face ashen and eyes wide with terror. He claimed to have seen 3 men standing silently around the fire, men dressed in Civil War uniforms. Stark wasn't drunk, and the fear in his voice left no room for doubt. We sat in stunned silence, unable to dismiss his story. After that night, the disturbances grew quieter. Small things like furniture shifting slightly, or objects disappearing and reappearing in strange places. We learned to live with the strangeness, even laughing about it. When guests stayed overnight, we pretended not to notice as their beds or sofas shook beneath them, grinning as they nervously tried to explain it away. But beneath the humor lay an unsettling truth. Despite everything, we never truly saw anything. There were no clear apparitions, no ghostly figures, only fleeting shadows and the relentless feeling that something unseen was always watching. That house remains etched in my memory, especially the events of that Halloween. It was a place where the boundary between the living and the dead felt paper-thin, where shadows whispered secrets from another time. And though we never discovered what haunted those halls, one thing was certain. It had chosen to reveal just enough to remind us that we were never truly alone. And perhaps, somewhere in those endless shadows, it is still waiting. It was the year I turned 18. I moved to New Jersey and started college here. Me, along with 2 of my friends, James and Ethan, rented a house and lived together. We stayed in a small house located in a peaceful and friendly suburban neighborhood in New Jersey. Aunt May, the owner of the house, was very kind to us. We each had separate rooms. James had a bedroom on the ground floor, as did Ethan. I, on the other hand, stayed in a room in the attic. I loved that room because of the privacy and comfort it provided. At that time, James and I were big fans of Halloween and the fall season in general. Every year, we would attend the Halloween festival organized by the school or go to Halloween parties held by our classmates. But this year, we just wanted to stay home and relax instead of going to those parties. That year, Halloween fell on a Friday, and we decided to stay home, watch some horror movies in my room in the attic, and just chill together. After watching a few movies, we started feeling bored. It was around midnight, and most of the kids had already gone home after trick-or-treating. Since the next day was Saturday, and we didn't have to go to school, James and I decided to go out for a walk and buy some snacks. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed back to keep an eye on the house. We started walking around the quiet, empty neighborhood. After stopping by a convenience store to buy a few packs of cigarettes and some snacks, we headed to a park that we usually visited almost every day. When we arrived near the park, since the main gate was locked at night, we decided to take the small path behind the park, where trees shaded the area, creating a dark and eerie atmosphere. Near the entrance were a few soccer fields and a picnic area, so we felt a bit more at ease. As we walked into the path behind the park under the dim streetlight, we suddenly stopped. Both of us noticed a man lying motionless on a bench. I called out, "Hey!" but there was no response. An uneasy feeling crept up on me. I suggested that we should go back home immediately, but James insisted on getting closer to check it out, which was strange since I was usually the braver one between the 2 of us. As we got closer, we confirmed that it was indeed a man. He was lying there still, with a coat covering his body. Trying not to panic, we slowly backed away, intending to turn back home without confronting him. But before we could move, another sound came from both sides of us. In the darkness, we saw two more figures approaching from each side. Unlike the first man, these two were moving towards us. Fear surged through me, my stomach tightening.
Run!
Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted out of the park, running straight back home and locking the door behind us. We dashed up to the attic, which was my room. Usually, I felt a strong sense of security whenever I returned to my room. But this time, I didn't. There was an overwhelming sense of unease, sitting in the attic with all the lights off. We anxiously kept looking out the window to see if anyone was watching or had followed us home. Both of us were too scared to know what to do next. After a while, Ethan woke up and came to ask us what had happened. After hearing the story, he was also very confused and didn't know what to do either. Were we really safe right now, or was it just someone trying to mess with us? Half an hour passed, and it seemed like everything was fine. There was no one watching outside. We felt a bit more at ease. We decided to close the door and pop open a few bottles of beer, starting a small party on Halloween night. Around 2:30 a.m., when we were slightly drunk and chatting about random things, suddenly a noise came from outside the kitchen window. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just a few rats. But when James went into the kitchen to check and pulled up the curtain, we were all completely creeped out. The pumpkin was lying in our backyard. This made us uneasy because we hadn't put up any Halloween decorations, and we certainly hadn't grown any pumpkins. This was the second time that night that we felt scared, and we quickly retreated back to the living room. At that moment, the fear sobered us up completely. The three of us were huddled together on the sofa, trying not to look outside the window. Our living room had no curtains, making it impossible for us not to glance out there. In a quick look out the window, we saw them. The three men that James and I had seen at the park were standing in the middle of the road, just standing there and staring directly at our house. We thought about calling the police, but then asked ourselves, what would we say to them? There are three strange men standing in front of my house, or they disturbed us in the middle of the night by throwing a pumpkin into our yard. At that moment, the three of us were utterly panicked and didn't know what to do. We just huddled together on the sofa, trying to focus on the sports show on TV to distract ourselves, clutching the empty beer bottles for some semblance of security. About 15 minutes later, we looked out the window again, and the three men had disappeared. The streetlights had also gone out, leaving only darkness outside. The entire night, we sat in the living room watching TV until we eventually dozed off. Morning finally arrived. We woke up early, even though it was Saturday. The three of us called Aunt May and told her about what had happened the previous night. Aunt May comforted us and said it was probably just some pranksters in the neighborhood trying to mess with us on Halloween night. We felt somewhat relieved because Aunt May had lived here for many years before renting the house to us. By the afternoon, we decided to go on a trip somewhere far away for the weekend to forget about the bizarre events of the night before. However, just as I opened the door, a note stuck to the door fell to the ground. It was a piece of paper with some scribbled writing that read, "Happy Halloween," along with a smiley face. We didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a greeting from a neighbor. But no. Upon closer inspection, we were utterly horrified by the small lines at the bottom. "P.S. Good thing you guys locked the door tightly." This sent a chill down our spines, making us feel the same fear as we had felt a few hours earlier, thinking we were in real danger. We cancelled our weekend trip and stayed inside the house for the rest of the weekend. Since then, every Halloween, I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't locked the door, or if we had decided to confront them that night. It may have been a peaceful little neighborhood, but on Halloween night, anything can happen. That autumn, I experienced a terrifying Halloween night that I still can't forget to this day. This is a story that happened many years ago, when I was still living in a small village, deep in the rural areas of northern Georgia. I've shared this story with my family and close friends, but no one believed me. They thought I was just making up a ghost story to scare everyone, but I know what I saw and felt that night was real. Back then, I lived with my family in a small house near the end of the village. It was a small, remote village with only a few households, but everyone knew each other and stayed closely connected. The village always had a quiet and somewhat eerie atmosphere, especially at night when only a few dim streetlights faintly illuminated the roads. The stillness was unsettling, and I always found myself walking a little faster when the sun set, hoping to get home before the creeping shadows swallowed up the path completely. At the beginning of the village, there was an old, abandoned house that had been empty for a long time. It used to belong to old William, the village elder, who had passed away about 10 years ago. Since old William passed away, the house gradually fell into disrepair. Weeds grew throughout the garden, and ivy crept up, covering the faded walls, making it look like a giant skeleton hidden beneath layers of vines. Most of the villagers avoided going near it, even during the day, fearing the strange energy that seemed to radiate from within. People in the village spoke of old William with a mix of respect and regret. He was once the pillar of the community, leading and protecting the village through many difficult times. It was said that he was always present, always watching, guiding the villagers in subtle ways. Yet, his death was shrouded in mystery. One night, he just vanished. They found his body at the bottom of a steep ravine a few miles outside the village, his cane lying beside him. It was a gruesome scene, and nobody could understand how or why he ended up there. Since that night, rumors spread that old William's spirit remained, not yet at peace, still lingering in his old home, watching over the village, or perhaps watching for something else. That Halloween night, me, along with a few friends, decided to go trick-or-treating around the village. Halloween in the countryside wasn't as lively as in the city, but for us, it was a special night when the kids could dress up as their favorite characters and collect as much candy as possible from our neighbors. Even if the village was small, we'd make a game out of it, seeing who could fill their bags the most by the end of the night. At that time, I was around 15 years old, dressed in a homemade superhero costume, while my friends, Jacob, Mike, and Hannah, each wore different spooky outfits. Jacob had dressed up as a classic zombie, with fake blood dripping down his face. Mike was a vampire, his plastic fangs making him lisp every time he spoke. And Hannah, who always wanted to stand out, was dressed as a sinister-looking witch. We went from house to house, collecting colorful candies, laughing and teasing each other. But as the night went on and our bags grew heavier, the conversation shifted.
"We're almost out of houses to visit,"
Mike said, glancing at the handful of lit-up windows left in the village.
Maybe it's time we go somewhere different?
Hannah suggested, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
How about old William's house?
No way!
Jacob said instantly, shaking his head.
That place is off limits. Everyone says it's haunted.
Exactly.
Hannah's eyes gleamed mischievously.
Which means no one else would dare go there. If we do, we'll be the only ones brave enough to say we did it.
Despite the uneasy feeling building in my gut, Hannah's challenge made me pause. Mike and I exchanged looks, and then, against better judgment, we both nodded. The curiosity and excitement of breaking a rule was too tempting to resist. We all wanted to prove ourselves, to become legends in the village for daring to face what everyone else feared. The whole group decided to head to old William's abandoned house, even if it was just to stand at the gate, knock on the door, and run away. We made our way through the village, the sound of our footsteps growing softer as we approached the shadowy outline of the old house. The closer we got, the quieter we became, each of us glancing nervously at the others. The pale moonlight shone on the decaying walls, making the place look like a giant ghost lurking in the shadows. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of rustling leaves in the wind and our footsteps softly echoing on the narrow path. The iron gate, though old and rusted, swung open silently when Hannah pushed it. We cautiously stepped through, every sense on high alert. Everything was covered in dust and overgrown vines, as if the place had been forgotten for decades. The front yard was a mess of tangled weeds and broken stone paths that crunched under our feet. The air seemed heavier here, and it smelled faintly of damp earth and decay. "We just need to knock on the door and head back," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. But as we moved closer to the porch, the front door, which had been boarded up and shut for years, slowly creaked open, emitting a chilling sound as if it hadn't been touched in a century. The group froze in place, our eyes fixed on the darkness behind the door. And then I saw a figure. It was an old man, wearing a long, dark coat and a battered hat. He stood right in the doorway, leaning on a wooden cane, staring at us with sunken, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Though he didn't say a word, his gaze seemed to ask, "What are you kids doing here at this hour?"
It's old William.
Mike whispered shakily, his voice barely audible. The old man didn't move. He just stood there, his silhouette sharp against the dim light of the moon. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed, not at the ground, not at the house, but directly at us. It felt like an accusation, a warning, or maybe an invitation.
Run!
Jacob suddenly screamed, breaking the spell that held us. Before we could react, he turned and bolted down the path. Instantly, we all followed, our hearts pounding, feet slipping on the overgrown path as we sprinted towards the gate. I felt as if there was an invisible force pulling me back, urging me to stop, to turn around and face the figure at the door. We didn't stop running until we reached the far end of the village. I dared to glance back once, expecting to see old William's shadow chasing us. But the house was dark and silent, as if it had never opened its door, as if no one had ever stood there. Since that night, none of us ever mentioned it again. Yet, every time I passed by that house at night, I always felt a pair of eyes watching me from the darkness. As if old William was still there, waiting for someone brave enough to return. I don't know if he truly wanted us to enter the house, or if it was just a trick of my mind. But one thing I know for sure, I'll never go near that house at night again. People often say that on Halloween night, the boundary between the living and the dead becomes the thinnest. And I know that night, I really did encounter something that didn't belong to this world. It was Halloween night in 2018, my senior year of college in California. I was renting a small apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and that night turned out to be an experience I would never forget. I'm a huge fan of Halloween, and every year I dedicate time to decorating my house for the occasion. But that year, Halloween fell on a weekday, and it happened to be pouring rain. My carefully thought out decoration plans were completely ruined. Frustrated, I decided to skip the decorations altogether, opting instead to sit in my living room with bowls of candy ready for the few brave trick-or-treaters who might venture out in the storm. To pass the time, I put on the movie Insidious, hoping the spooky atmosphere would lift my mood. After about an hour and a half, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my friend Michael in our group chat, asking if anyone was free to come over and hang out for a little impromptu Halloween party. My heart lifted at the idea of some company. It had been a long time since we'd all gotten together, and the prospect of having friends over on such a gloomy night was more than welcome. The others quickly agreed. Sarah, Mary, Chris, and Harry all responded with enthusiasm, and in just 15 minutes, they showed up at my place. They brought along snacks and drinks, and within moments, the house that had felt so dreary just moments before was now filled with laughter, light, and warmth. We spent the next hour or so eating, chatting, and catching up. It was exactly the kind of Halloween evening I'd hoped for. Around midnight, as the conversation began to wind down, Chris leaned forward with a mischievous grin.
Hey, how about we make things a bit more exciting?
He suggested.
Why don't we play a spooky game?
I hesitated. I've always been a bit superstitious, and playing with the supernatural wasn't something I took lightly. But the others seemed excited by the idea. Sarah threw out a few classic suggestions, like Bloody Mary and the Ouija board, but we'd done those in the past. Then, Chris, his grin widening, proposed we play hide and seek in the dark. I had heard of it before. It sounded like a typical hide and seek game, but playing it with the lights off and after midnight gave it a sinister edge. Rumors online spoke of strange sightings, eerie sensations, and encounters with figures that weren't supposed to be there. It was said that when you play in complete darkness, sometimes you aren't alone. I shivered at the thought, but everyone else seemed so excited. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. "All right, let's do it," I said reluctantly. We agreed to turn off every light in the house, leaving just a single, flickering candle in the living room. The candle cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, adding to the creepy atmosphere. The rules were simple. The seeker would count to 50 in the dark, eyes closed, while everyone else hid anywhere in the house. The first person found would be the next seeker. Sarah volunteered to be it first. She stood in the middle of the living room, covered her eyes, and began to count. The rest of us scattered in silence, doing our best to find the perfect hiding spots. I could hear her counting softly in the background as I slipped into a small closet under the stairs. The cramped space was barely big enough for me, and the darkness felt thick and suffocating. I pressed my back against the wall, listening intently.
48, 49, 50.
Sarah's voice rang out in the darkness.
Ready or not, here I come.
I held my breath, my heart pounding. Footsteps echoed faintly through the house as Sarah moved from room to room. Suddenly, I heard her shout triumphantly, followed by a burst of laughter. She had found Chris hiding behind the living room curtains. I relaxed slightly. It was just a normal game after all. Now it was Chris's turn. I crept out of my hiding spot and quietly made my way to the bathroom in my bedroom. I closed the door gently and crouched down behind the shower curtain. Minutes passed. I could hear Chris's footsteps getting closer and closer. I froze, holding my breath. But then, just as he was about to pass by, a tickle in my throat made me cough loudly. The footsteps stopped.
Gotcha!
Chris called out, his face appearing around the doorframe a moment later. I groaned playfully and joined him back in the living room. Now it was my turn. I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. As I reached 50, I opened my eyes and looked around. The house was draped in darkness, except for the tiny flame of the candle that flickers uncertainty on the coffee table. Shadows stretched and shrunk with each flicker, giving the room a haunted, almost alive feel. I started my search in the kitchen. Nothing. The bathroom, empty. I then made my way through the bedrooms, my footsteps almost silent on the creaky wooden floor. When I reached my own room, I heard a soft giggle from the closet. I threw the door open and found Mary huddled in the corner. Gotcha. I laughed, and she laughed too, stepping out of her hiding spot.
That was quick.
She teased.
Who else is left?
For more to go, I whispered, signaling for her to join me. We continued our search together, moving quietly through the house. We had almost made it to the top of the stairs when a strange sound came from the storage room downstairs. It was a soft creak, like the sound of a door being gently pushed open. I looked at Mary. Did you hear that? She nodded, wide-eyed. We tiptoed back down the stairs and stopped in front of the small storage room near the living room. The door was slightly open, and darkness poured out like a heavy fog. Maybe Harry or Chris is hiding in there, I whispered. I pushed the door open carefully. The faint candlelight barely reached inside, casting eerie shadows across the stacked boxes and old, forgotten items. I stepped inside cautiously, listening for any hint of movement. There was a faint rustling from the far corner of the room, followed by what sounded like breathing. My heart rate spiked. Just as I took another step forward, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Mary, I yelled, panic rising in my chest. There was no answer. Darkness enveloped me completely, and I fumbled around, trying to find the doorknob. But it felt as if it was locked from the outside. Fear clawed at my mind. Then I heard a soft, chilling chuckle. I spun around. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. Small, hunched over, and staring straight at me. Harry, Chris, I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Slowly, it began to stand up. It was impossibly tall, thin, and had a grotesque grin stretching from ear to ear. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixated on me. I stood frozen, my body refusing to obey as the figure took a step closer. Who are you? I stammered. It didn't respond. Instead, it laughed softly and took another step forward. Panic surged through me. I threw myself at the door, pounding on it desperately. Just as I felt the figure's presence looming over me, the door suddenly flew open. I stumbled out into the living room, gasping for breath. Mary and Harry stared at me, their faces pale. There was someone in the storage room, I shouted. They exchanged confused glances.
No, there's no one there, look.
I turned around, trembling, and looked inside. The room was empty. We checked the entire house, but there was no sign of the figure I had seen. My friends tried to comfort me, saying it must have been my imagination. Maybe it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. We decided to end the game and sat in the living room, still shaken. Just as we were starting to calm down, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. The game's over already. Thanks for playing with me. Let's play again soon. I stared in horror, my hands trembling. The others looked up at me, their faces white with fear. A moment later, their phones buzzed too. Each of them had received the same message. I tried to reply, but the messages wouldn't send. We never figured out who sent those messages, and we never played hide and seek in the dark again. Halloween can be a fun night for games, but some games shouldn't be played, especially when you don't know who's really playing with you. I am a single, 22-year-old woman living alone in a small house in a quiet suburb of New York. I moved here about 6 months ago after starting a new job in the city. It's a quaint little neighborhood, lined with old trees that create long shadows on the roads at night. Most of the houses around me are occupied by families, so it felt a bit strange being the only person living alone. During my first few weeks, the house felt empty and unfamiliar, and I often missed the comfort of having my family around. But I kept telling myself that this was my first step towards being independent, and I needed to get used to it. Since Halloween was approaching, I thought it would be a good opportunity to interact with my neighbors and show that I'm friendly. I decided to decorate the front yard to join in the Halloween spirit, and of course, planned to give out candy to the local kids. I thought it would be a good way to feel connected to the community. On the morning of Halloween, I spent hours putting up decorations. I carved pumpkins and placed them along the front steps, their eerie smiles lit up by small candles. I hung fake spider webs around the porch and set up a few scarecrows around the yard. I even dressed up a bit, putting on a festive orange sweater with a big black cat printed on it. By late afternoon, the trick-or-treaters started coming. Groups of children in colorful costumes, along with their parents, knocked on my door, and I happily handed out candy. Many parents stayed for a little chat, and I even learned the names of a few families living nearby, which made me feel a little more at ease. Everything went perfectly well until around 10 p.m. By then, the number of trick-or-treaters had started to dwindle, and most of the porch lights on my street were already turned off. I decided it was time to wrap up. I stood on my porch, looking at the nearly empty candy bowl in my hands, when suddenly I heard the sound of small, shuffling footsteps coming from the street. Then, a soft, whispering voice echoed through the still night.
Trick or treat.
Startled, I looked up and saw a figure standing across the street under the shadow of a tall oak tree. It looked like a child, but the streetlight was too dim to make out any details. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, and noticed that the figure was wearing a strange costume. It had on a tattered, old-fashioned red dress and a plain white mask that covered its entire face. The mask was featureless, no mouth, no nose, just two hollow eye holes.
Come on over.
I called, forcing a smile.
I have some candy left for you.
But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from the darkness with its head slightly tilted. I started to feel a bit uneasy, but I told myself it was probably just a shy kid. After all, it was still Halloween, and maybe they were just nervous to come up to a stranger's house. I took a step forward, hoping to encourage the child to come closer. But as soon as I did, the figure turned abruptly and began walking down the road, disappearing into the shadows cast by the trees. I watched it for a moment, feeling confused. Something about the way it moved seemed strange to smooth, almost gliding along the sidewalk. But I shook my head, thinking I was just letting my imagination run wild. I turned back to my porch, ready to go inside, when I heard it again.
Trick or treat.
This time, the voice was clearer, almost right in front of me. I turned around sharply. The child was back, but now it was standing at the edge of my front yard, right behind the low fence. My heart started pounding. How did it get back so quickly? And why wasn't there any sign of fear or excitement? It just stood there, completely still, watching me. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, still holding the bowl of candy.
What kind of candy do you want?
I asked, my voice a bit shaky. The figure didn't respond. It tilted its head to the other side, as if examining me. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The cloth bag it was holding was empty. A child out trick-or-treating all night without any candy. A cold shiver ran down my spine.
Come on, take some.
I offered, trying to sound calm, even though I felt anything but. The child stepped onto the sidewalk, moving closer. As it approached, I instinctively took a step back. Under the porch light, I could finally see the costume clearly. The red dress was torn and dirty, with dark stains that looked almost like dried blood. I quickly dropped the handful of candy into the bag, but the child didn't react. It just kept staring at me through the mask's empty eye holes. I felt a chill go down my spine.
Alright, happy Halloween.
I muttered, backing away and turning to head inside. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned around, and my breath caught in my throat. The child was now standing on my porch, just a few feet away. My hands started trembling.
What do you want?
I whispered, my voice barely audible.
Trick or treat.
The voice was deeper now, almost like an adult's, and it sent a wave of fear through me. Without thinking, I dashed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, then pressed my back against it, panting heavily. I looked through the peephole, but the porch was empty. The figure had disappeared again. I thought it was over. But the next night, at exactly the same time, I heard the same voice outside my living room window.
Trick or treat.
I peered through the curtains and felt my blood run cold. The child was back, standing outside, staring in through the glass. The same red dress, the same blank white mask. It didn't move or say anything else, just stood there, waiting. I screamed and called the police. By the time they arrived, the child was gone. They searched the area but found no sign of anyone. The officers told me it was probably just a neighborhood prank, but I knew it wasn't. Now, Halloween is almost here again, and I'm terrified. Will that child come back? Will I have to face those empty eyes once more? I just hope, with everything in me, that I won't hear that chilling whisper outside my window again. Every year when Halloween comes around, I usually go trick-or-treating around the neighborhood with my friends Ben and Harrison. But back then, we were still young, and our parents would usually come along with us. Since our houses were very close to each other, we had been close friends from a young age. And Ben and Harrison's parents were also very close with mine. We were good neighbors to each other. But this year, we were 13 years old, so it was the first year we went trick-or-treating without any parents accompanying us. Naturally, we were very excited to run around the neighborhood, collect candy, and simply have fun. Every year, before Halloween, we would carefully plan out our trick-or-treat route. We would always aim for the biggest houses we could find, because those were the places where we could get full-size chocolate bars. At the end of last year, there was a luxurious and upscale street under construction, and finally this year, it was completed. All the people who bought homes there had moved in. So this year we planned to go to that neighborhood first, and then move on to other places afterward. This new row of houses was located right at the beginning of the street, only about a 10-minute walk away. So, at exactly 8 p.m., after my family had finished dinner, Ben and Harrison arrived at my house, and we began our trick-or-treat adventure. We first stopped by the houses around my place, because they were all our very friendly neighbors. And after that, we crossed the street to head over to the new neighborhood. After about 10 minutes of walking, we finally arrived at the new row of houses. To our surprise, we didn't see any kids trick-or-treating in the area. Even though the houses were all beautifully decorated for Halloween, we figured that the kids in this neighborhood hadn't been allowed out yet, and that made us even more excited, so we quickly ran to the first house. The large door gradually opened, and a kind elderly man greeted us with a warm smile and handed each of us a full-size Snickers bar.
Happy Halloween, kids!
As we left the driveway, we were all extremely excited because of the smooth start. But when we got to the next few houses, none of them opened their doors. After about 10 houses with no one answering, we began to feel like we were wasting our Halloween here without getting anything. And we thought maybe the people living here were celebrating the holiday somewhere else. But there was still one last hope for us on this street. The biggest house in the neighborhood, located at the very end of the road. We decided to head there and give it one last try before moving on to another area. This house was truly massive, looking almost like a palace. It was extravagant and grand. That only made us even more excited, thinking they would give us big chocolate bars. As we climbed the stairs to the house, I didn't see anyone, which gave us the feeling that the owners of this house might also be out, and we would be wasting our time going up to yet another house without any candy. Still, we went up to the porch, and I rang the doorbell. Immediately, an elderly woman opened the door and greeted us. Both of them smiled as we said, "Trick or treat," and the woman opened the door wider, revealing a large round table set up in their spacious living room. On the table, there were nearly all types of high-end candy and chocolate that you could find in stores. This was truly a dream come true for us. It was the first time I had ever met someone who spent so much money for Halloween. But looking at their house, I guess it made sense. She told us to come in and choose 2 types of candy or chocolate that we liked. Without hesitation, we all ran inside, marveling at all the different kinds of candy and chocolate they had displayed on the table. We were all so excited at that moment to be able to choose almost anything we wanted. But just as I was debating between a hammer candy or an extra chocolate bar, suddenly I heard the door slam shut. We all turned around, and the woman was still standing there. She then told us to stay a little while longer, because she had a special gift for us. At that moment, both Ben and I were extremely scared and worried, but Harrison wasn't. He was excited about the special gift. I honestly didn't understand what he was thinking. Ben and I gradually backed towards the door, ready to run, while Harrison still sat there. The sound of her footsteps grew louder. I immediately opened the door and ran outside, and Harrison, confused, followed us. I could hear the woman's frantic screams, calling us to come back. At that point, the main door of the house had already been locked by her. We quickly ran to her backyard. I could clearly hear her footsteps and voice right behind us. We hid in a nearby bush, waiting for her to pass, then quickly climbed over the wall and escaped from that place. We kept running until we finally made it back to my house. The 3 of us sat in front of the garage, panting heavily. Ben suggested that we should tell our parents about what happened, but I was certain that if I told them, they would scold me because they had warned me not to enter strangers' houses. So, we decided to stay quiet and keep the whole thing a secret. After a while, we became more cautious, no longer daring to go trick-or-treating with just a few people. We gathered a few other kids who were also out trick-or-treating, and we all went together around my neighborhood. That was definitely the scariest thing that had ever happened to me on Halloween. And to this day, Ben and Harrison still talk about it every year during Halloween. I still don't know what the special gift the woman had prepared for us was, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened to us if she had caught us while we were running. It was an unforgettable experience. Halloween has always been a time for me and my dad to embark on exciting adventures. Unlike other kids who are busy trick-or-treating or dressing up as spooky characters, my dad and I usually choose a different path, one that's more adventurous, exploring, abandoned, old places that no one seems to dare to visit. This year, my dad heard about an abandoned house deep in the forest, and as soon as he suggested exploring it on Halloween night, I couldn't say no. The house was located far from town, on a secluded road that led into the woods. My dad drove slowly along the winding roads, where even the streetlights barely illuminated anything. The only light came from our car's headlights, casting a glow on the dark trees lining the road. I looked out the window, feeling the cold autumn air seep into my skin. A sense of eeriness began to spread, but with my dad, I always felt safe. He was the only person who could make me feel secure on such adventurous trips. As we got closer to the abandoned house, I couldn't help but feel the atmosphere around us growing darker. The trees surrounding the house grew wild and thick, as if they were trying to swallow the house into the forest's shadows. Gentle breezes blew through, making the branches creak, creating a spooky sound like the signs of a forgotten past. We arrived just as night had fully fallen. The house loomed before us, tall and dilapidated. The walls were peeling, with patches of old red paint still clinging in spots to the brick underneath. Broken windows glistened in the moonlight, and part of the roof had collapsed, making the house look even more frightening. But that's exactly why my dad and I loved places like this. They were full of mystery, and you never knew what you might find. We turned off the car engine and stepped out, flashlights in hand. My dad smiled at me, encouraging, ready. This time we might find something interesting. I nodded, excited despite feeling a little nervous. The two of us began walking toward the house, making our way through the path that was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The front door was no longer there, leaving a gaping entrance, like a deep, dark hole waiting for us to step inside. Inside the house, the cold and musty air hit my nose, making me shiver. The old wooden floor was rotting, with boards that could easily collapse at any moment. Every step echoed with creaking sounds beneath our feet. Shattered glass was scattered everywhere, and I had to carefully step around it, afraid that one small misstep might cause injury. In the dim light of our flashlights, everything appeared faint and shadowy, as if the house had been sleeping for decades. On the walls, the remnants of old, peeling wallpaper showed faint traces of the life that once existed in this place. We explored room by room, finding fragments of a long-gone life-old furniture, books eaten away by termites, and small items that the house's former residents likely left behind when they departed. I could almost imagine the echoes of laughter from the family that once lived here, now nothing more than forgotten pieces of memories. When we entered the living room, my dad's flashlight shone into a dark corner. I saw something in the corner that made me shiver. It was an old doll, probably from decades ago, lying still on an old rocking chair. It was wearing a white dress that had turned yellow with age, its large round eyes staring blankly ahead. Its hair was frizzy and tangled, and its entire body was covered in dust. My dad noticed what I was looking at, glanced over, and laughed. It's just an old doll, probably from some child who used to live here. He walked closer to the doll, looking at it curiously. Actually, it's in pretty good shape compared to the other things here. I forced a laugh, trying to act casual, but a growing sense of unease began to settle in. There was something about this doll that I couldn't take my eyes off of. Those big eyes seemed to follow our every movement, even though the doll didn't budge. We continued to explore the other rooms, but the whole time, I felt as though the doll's eyes were watching me. We moved on to the rest of the house, but there was nothing particularly special, just the remnants of a time long past. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, and the doll's eyes continued to haunt me. I looked back several times, and each time, I had the feeling that the doll's eyes had shifted, as if it was watching me from afar. As we were about to leave the house, I couldn't resist looking back at the doll one last time. My heart pounded when I noticed something strange. Its eyes were no longer staring blankly as before. Now, they were looking straight at me. Its previously expressionless eyebrows were now furrowed, giving it a menacing look. The faint smile it had earlier was gone, replaced by an empty, haunting expression. I jumped, feeling a chill down my spine. I thought about telling my dad, but hesitated. Would he believe me? Or would he think I was just imagining things? I didn't want to worry him, and I certainly didn't want him to stop taking me on these adventures. So, I stayed quiet and followed him out of the house, but the image of the doll kept lingering in my mind. After we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that doll. The image of those eyes and that terrifying smile haunted me in my sleep, making it impossible to get any rest. I kept wondering whether what I saw was real or just a figment of my imagination. A few days later, my dad decided to return to the house with my older brother to take some photos. He liked capturing the places we had visited, and this abandoned house was the perfect addition to his collection of creepy photos. When he returned, he eagerly showed me the pictures he had taken. I grabbed the camera and flipped through each one, trying to find the image of the doll. But strangely, there wasn't a single picture of the doll. The rocking chair was still there, but it was empty, with no trace of the doll I had seen before. I asked my dad about the doll, but he just shrugged. I didn't see any doll. Maybe someone took it. I didn't know how to explain this. Was the doll even real? If it was, why had it disappeared so mysteriously? These questions kept swirling in my mind, but there were no answers. That Halloween night left me with a deep sense of unease about what could happen in abandoned places. And since then, I've never looked at an old doll the same way again. The questions about that doll will remain forever unanswered, and I never returned to that house again. It was around September when I was looking for a temporary job to earn some extra income. I applied to amusement parks and shopping malls, thinking that those jobs would suit me because I enjoyed having fun at work. Finally, by mid-October, I landed a temporary job at a Halloween store in a shopping mall. This store only opened once a year during the Halloween season and closed immediately afterward. The store wasn't anything special, but it was filled with creepy costumes, scary decorations, and animated monsters. For me, it was an easy way to make some pocket money while still in high school. I attended school in the morning, took some time to rest in the afternoon, and worked the night shift from 5 p.m. until the store closed. Usually, that would be around 10 p.m. Most of the time, the store was pretty quiet and boring. I would usually sit at the cash register with my co-worker, Megan, chatting and scrolling through our phones when there were no customers. The customers were typically families looking for costumes for their kids or groups of teenagers buying masks. But one night, things got strange in a way I had never experienced before. It was around 9 p.m., and that night Megan had called in sick, so I was the only one working in the store. It was Halloween, so the store was packed with customers, and we were going to stay open an hour later than usual. After the customers slowly trickled out, I finally got a bit of time to rest after having to do all the work by myself, covering for Megan. I sat at the cash register, listening to the store's background music and occasionally hearing the buzzing from the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. Every now and then, the animated monsters outside the store would make noises when someone walked by or touched them. At that point, the other stores in the mall were also starting to close, and the mall was becoming quieter. I felt a bit bored, so I took the opportunity to scroll through my phone to pass the time until closing. As I absent-mindedly skimmed through social media posts, the sound of the door chime suddenly rang, signaling that a customer had just entered the store. I looked up and immediately noticed that the person who entered was unlike the usual customers. It was a tall, thin man wearing a long, worn-out black coat. A black fedora was pulled low, obscuring most of his face. He glided into the store with a calm demeanor, but there was something about him that made me feel uneasy. The man silently walked down the aisles of the store without saying a word. He stopped in front of the strange costumes, the hollow-eyed masks, and the fake skeletons that rattled whenever someone touched them. I didn't dare look directly at him, but my eyes unintentionally followed his every step. Each time he moved past the racks, I had the sensation that the atmosphere in the store became more stifling, as if his presence was suffocating the space around him. After a few minutes, the man approached the checkout counter. He placed a simple, glossy black mask on the counter, its hollow eyes devoid of any expression. I glanced up at his face, hidden beneath the black hat, and tried to smile politely, though I felt a tinge of nervousness inside.
"How much for this mask?"
he asked, his voice deep and raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. I picked up the mask to check the price. "This one is $15, sir," I replied, my hands trembling as I tapped into the cash register. He stood still, staring at me from beneath the brim of his hat, his gaze cold as ice. The atmosphere became strangely tense.
"Do you like Halloween?"
he asked, his deep voice calm, yet it felt like he was testing me. I was a bit startled by the unrelated question, but still tried to answer. "Yes, I do. I love Halloween because people get to dress up and enjoy the festive atmosphere," I replied with a nervous smile. The man kept his unblinking gaze on me, his voice soft but commanding.
"Do you know? Halloween isn't just about costumes and candy. Sometimes it's about what we don't see. Have you ever thought that the things we think are costumes might not really be costumes at all?"
My heart began to race. I didn't fully understand what he was implying, but the air in the store felt suffocating and terrifying. I glanced around the store as if searching for some invisible help, but there was no one. The man pulled $15 out of his coat pocket, and I quickly completed the transaction, handing him the mask. "Thank you for your purchase. Have a great Halloween night," I said. He took the mask, but before leaving, he leaned down close to the counter. I could smell a foul odor emanating from his worn-out coat. He whispered, almost just loud enough for me to hear.
"Be careful. Some things here are not just decorations."
His words sent a chill down my spine. I stood frozen as he walked out of the store. The door closed behind him, but I couldn't move. All of my senses seemed paralyzed, my body unable to react. It was now 11 o'clock, time to close the store. I went around checking the store one last time before ending my shift. His words echoed in my mind, making it impossible to look at the store items the same way. A few minutes later, I finished the check and headed back to the register, planning to write a note about the strange man I had just encountered. But when I looked down at the counter, my heart nearly stopped. The glossy black mask he had bought was still there, untouched, never taken. Panic surged through me as I rushed to the door to see if he was still there. But the parking lot was empty, with only the faint silhouettes of a few night shift security guards in the distance. There was no sign of anyone else, no trace that he had ever left. I returned inside and picked up the mask. When I flipped it over, I saw a small, scribbled message inside, written in black ink. "Be careful. Some things here are not just decorations." I dropped the mask in shock, fear engulfing my body. It felt like I had just witnessed something that didn't belong in this world. I looked around the store, the flickering lights from the fluorescent bulbs on the ceiling casting eerie shadows across the room. At that moment, I heard a noise. The buzzing sound from the store's sound system suddenly stopped, and for a brief second, I swear I saw a shadow pass by, gliding past the front glass window. The shape looked exactly like the man who had entered the store earlier, but it was just a fleeting shadow that disappeared in a matter of seconds, too unclear to identify. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, I heard a sound footsteps coming from the storage room. It was clear that I was the only one working that day, so no one else should be back there. The strange man's words from earlier suddenly flooded back into my mind, and a wave of fear spread through me, consuming all my thoughts. The footsteps grew louder, as if they were coming closer. I hurriedly flipped off the breaker and locked the door, rushing out of the store without daring to look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the man and his warning replayed in my mind over and over. And since that night, I've always wondered were the things I saw and heard real, or was it just an illusion on a mysterious Halloween night? But one thing I knew for sure, I could never forget the feeling of his cold eyes staring right through me, as if he knew more than anyone about the things I couldn't see. That very night, I texted my manager and quit the Halloween store. It was a terrifying and haunting experience, but now looking back, it was kind of thrilling too. Last Halloween, my family decided to do something more special than usual. A trip to one of the most haunted locations in the US, the Crescent Hotel, located in the historic town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. This hotel has a long, eerie history, built in the late 19th century, with numerous ghostly legends attached to it. It was once a hospital and a fraudulent cancer treatment center run by a shady doctor, where dozens of people tragically passed away. Many claim that the spirits of these unfortunate patients and others who once lived in the hotel still linger there, haunting the halls. My family has always been fascinated by ghost stories, and have always been especially drawn to anything supernatural. My parents even organized a small Halloween party at the hotel with some friends and relatives. However, instead of enjoying the party, I was tasked with taking care of my 80-year-old cousin, Dylan, who was super excited about trick-or-treating. At 16, I wasn't as interested in going door-to-door for candy anymore, but I still loved the spooky atmosphere of Halloween. Eureka Springs is a small, peaceful town steeped in history. The cobblestone streets, old-fashioned houses with wooden shutters, and brightly lit street lamps made it the perfect setting for Halloween. As night fell, the entire town seemed to take on a ghostly atmosphere. The glow of flickering jack-o'-lanterns, the rustling of dry leaves, and the sound of distant laughter created an unsettling yet exciting mood that set the tone for the evening. As soon as the family party kicked off, Dylan and I left the Crescent Hotel and ventured out into the surrounding neighborhood for trick-or-treating. The houses in the area were large, with red brick walls and old-style roofs. Many were decorated with incredible detail, glowing jack-o'-lanterns, giant witch statues, and mannequins dressed as ghosts that hung eerily from the trees. I couldn't help but feel like this Halloween had a special air of magic and mystery. Dylan, in his wizard costume, was filled with energy, running from house to house with excitement, collecting as much candy as possible. I followed from a safe distance, keeping an eye on him but allowing him the freedom to enjoy himself. As Dylan approached each house, I stood back, admiring the surrounding homes and the quiet, spooky vibe that deepened as we walked further into the neighborhood. The busier streets near the hotel faded away, leaving us in a more isolated part of town. After about an hour, Dylan's candy bag was filled to the brim, but he still wasn't ready to call it a night. He kept asking to visit just a few more houses. By that point, the cold had started to get to me, and I was ready to head back to the warmth of the hotel, but Dylan was persistent. I finally gave in, although I told him it would be the last house. "This is the final one," I warned, and Dylan quickly agreed, excitement renewed. While Dylan darted off to the next house, I was momentarily distracted by a grand house down the street, elaborately decorated with twinkling lights. massive ghostly figures, and bright lampposts that illuminated the entire block. I stood in awe, completely mesmerized by the decorations, and for a few minutes, I forgot all about Dylan. When I turned back, Dylan was gone. My heart raced. I scanned the area but saw no sign of him. Panic set in, and I quickly walked down the street, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. Just then, the sharp screeching of tires filled the air, followed by a terrified scream coming from a distance. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the sound, my heart pounding as fear gripped me. When I arrived, Dylan was nowhere in sight. A black car sped away down the road, its tires screeching as it rounded the corner. Panic washed over me as I frantically called out Dylan's name, searching everywhere for him. I was completely overwhelmed with fear until an elderly man sitting on his porch nearby noticed my distress. He rushed over, asking, "Where's the boy?" When I couldn't respond from shock, he continued, "I saw a man trying to force him into a car, but the boy screamed and kicked at him. The man panicked and drove off. I think the boy ran away." Tears of relief welled up in my eyes as I heard a rustling sound from behind a nearby bush. I rushed over to find Dylan, trembling and curled up behind the bush, terrified. I hugged him tightly, feeling as if I had just escaped a nightmare. The elderly man immediately called the police and urged us to stay with him until they arrived, not wanting us to walk back alone while the kidnapper might still be nearby. The police arrived within minutes and took our statements. Dylan, still shaken, recounted how the man had tried to pull him into the car, but he had screamed and kicked until the man fled. The officers assured us they would investigate the matter and escorted us back to the Crescent Hotel. When we returned, my family was already in a panic. My parents were beside themselves with worry, and we had to explain the entire ordeal to them and the police. The officers helped file a report and promised to find the kidnapper. That Halloween night, the ghost stories and haunted legends of the Crescent Hotel no longer seemed frightening to me. The reality of Dylan almost being kidnapped made me realize that the true monsters aren't ghosts or spirits, but the people with bad intentions lurking in the shadows. It was the most terrifying experience I've ever gone through, and since then, I've been much more cautious when walking at night, especially during festivals like Halloween. While the thrill of the supernatural can be exciting, I realized that the real dangers often come from living, breathing people, not the ghost stories we grow up hearing.